The shattered illusion of stability. For decades, Western leaders built their policies on the premise that diplomacy could hold the fragile structure of peace together. In glossy halls of power, handshakes, treaties, and public statements created the image of a stable world order. The EU proclaimed itself a beacon of cooperation, while Washington reassured its citizens and allies that, though crises might flare, they could always be contained. That illusion has now been shattered. The collapse of negotiations under Kiev is more than a failure of diplomacy, it is a violent reminder that beneath the surface of order lay unresolved tensions. For the European Union, this came as a shockwave. Leaders in Brussels had clung to the belief that dialogue was enough, that patience and persistence would eventually bring reconciliation. Instead, the talks dissolved into chaos, leaving bitterness in their wake. The EU, already burdened by internal disputes, found itself blindsided. In Washington, the mood was no less grim. American officials had invested not only time and resources but also credibility in the idea that peace was within reach. The narrative sold to the public was simple: America, once again, was the architect of stability. But with the negotiations collapsing, that narrative has been ripped apart. Suddenly, commentators and analysts across the United States began asking uncomfortable questions. Was America truly in control? Or had it miscalculated the strength of forces operating in the shadows? The emergence of partisans, figures long dismissed as relics of another age, added a chilling dimension to the crisis. Their presence was both symbolic and real, symbolic of the failure of official institutions, and real in their capacity to destabilize. For policymakers in the West, this was the nightmare scenario. Diplomacy thrives on predictability, on the assumption that all players prefer order to chaos. But what happens when chaos itself becomes a weapon? For ordinary Europeans, the consequences began to sink in almost immediately. Newspapers in Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw carried grim headlines. Markets reacted nervously, energy prices climbed, and fears of unrest spread. What had seemed like a distant negotiation, a technical matter of diplomacy, suddenly became a threat to daily life. The idea that peace had been cancelled was no longer a metaphor but a headline, searing itself into the public consciousness. American citizens, too, felt the ripples. Television networks switched to emergency coverage, replaying images of broken talks, tense security, and ominous warnings from intelligence officials. The story was framed as both a foreign crisis and a domestic vulnerability. If peace could collapse abroad, what did that say about America's ability to manage crises at home? The sense of unease grew heavier with every passing hour. What makes this episode a disaster is not only the fact of failed negotiations but also the collapse of trust. Western institutions had promised solutions, yet delivered only more uncertainty. The EU had prided itself on unity, but whispers of division began to grow louder. Washington had vowed leadership, yet its grip on events appeared weaker than ever. Trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. And in this moment, both Brussels and Washington found themselves confronting the terrifying truth: the foundations of their authority were crumbling. The illusion of stability, so carefully maintained, has evaporated. What remains is a raw, unfiltered reality, where agreements are broken, shadows grow longer, and partisans step into the void. The West, once confident in its power to manage crises, now faces a disaster of its own making. The question looming over both continents is no longer whether peace can be restored, but whether the very system built on peace can survive the storm ahead. The collapse of diplomacy. The images of negotiators storming out of the chamber will haunt policymakers for years. What was meant to be a historic reconciliation dissolved into shouting, accusations, and silence. Diplomacy, the tool of choice for both the EU and the US, failed not in private but in full public view. The cameras captured not just the breakdown of talks but also the collapse of confidence. Western officials had arrived in Kiev with carefully prepared talking points. They spoke of compromise, progress, and shared responsibility. Yet the realities on the ground told a different story. Factions who had never accepted the negotiations as legitimate seized the moment. Their message was clear: deals struck in conference rooms mean nothing if they do not reflect the raw power dynamics outside. When word spread that partisans had emerged from the shadows, it was not merely a tactical move, it was a statement of defiance. The EU had gambled everything on this round of talks. For Brussels, success would have proven the value of its soft power model, diplomacy backed by economic incentives. Instead, the opposite happened. The breakdown underscored the EU's inability to enforce agreements. Member states began pointing fingers. Some accused the Commission of naivety, others argued that Eastern European concerns had been ignored. The myth of a unified European voice cracked further. In Washington, the reaction was sharper. The United States had invested its prestige, believing its presence alone could guide the process. But as images of chaos spread, so did the perception of American weakness. Analysts warned that allies were beginning to doubt Washington's ability to deliver results. Rivals, meanwhile, saw opportunity. If the U.S. could not control events in Kyiv, what else was it failing to manage? The collapse also changed the psychology of the conflict. For years, diplomacy had been the safety valve, a guarantee that, no matter how bad things became, leaders could always retreat to the table. With that option gone, the stakes grew higher. The West faced an unpredictable future where violence, not negotiation, shaped outcomes. That uncertainty rippled through capitals worldwide, reinforcing the sense that a disaster was unfolding in real time. A strategic earthquake for the EU. For the European Union, the collapse of peace talks was more than a diplomatic failure. It was a strategic earthquake. The EU, founded on the idea that dialogue prevents conflict, suddenly found itself powerless. This was not just embarrassing, it was existential. Energy markets reacted brutally. With instability growing under Kyiv, pipelines and supply routes were thrown into doubt. Prices surged, hitting households already battered by inflation. European leaders promised relief, but citizens saw only rising bills. Protests flared in several capitals, demanding answers. The anger was not only about energy, it was about trust in the EU's ability to protect its people. Political fractures deepened. Eastern states, closer to the turmoil, demanded stronger measures. Western states urged caution, fearing escalation. Southern states complained that their economic struggles were being ignored. The crisis magnified divisions that had long simmered beneath the surface. The dream of a unified Europe looked increasingly fragile. Outside Europe, the EU's reputation took a blow. It had long promoted itself as a mediator, an alternative to American power. Now it appeared weak, reactive, and divided. Rivals mocked Brussels' impotence, while partners questioned its reliability. For the EU, the episode was not just a foreign policy failure, it was a fundamental test of identity. The question echoing across the continent was stark. If the EU cannot prevent disaster on its doorstep, what is it for? Washington's nightmare. Across the Atlantic, the United States faced its own reckoning. Washington had spent years positioning itself as the indispensable power, the guarantor of order. But the collapse under Kyiv revealed limits that were impossible to ignore. Domestically, the administration faced fierce criticism. Lawmakers accused officials of overpromising and underdelivering. Commentators warned that America's global credibility was evaporating. The narrative of strength gave way to a narrative of incompetence. Public opinion, already weary of foreign entanglements, hardened further. Many asked why billions were spent abroad when results seemed so elusive. Internationally, allies grew nervous. If Washington could not manage negotiations in Europe, what did that mean for its commitments in Asia or the Middle East? Questions about reliability spread, shaking alliances built over decades. Rival powers, watching closely, saw weakness and opportunity. China, in particular, wasted no time in presenting itself as a steadier alternative. The nightmare for Washington was not only the failure itself but the loss of control over the story. For decades, America had shaped global narratives, framing itself as the problem solver. Now, others framed America as part of the problem. The disaster under Kyiv became a symbol of decline. Behind closed doors, officials debated options: more military support, new sanctions, fresh diplomatic pushes. Yet every path carried risks. Doing too little looked weak, doing too much looked reckless. The United States found itself trapped, aware that any move might worsen the crisis. For a superpower accustomed to projecting confidence, the uncertainty was paralyzing. A new global reality. With peace cancelled and diplomacy shattered, the world entered uncharted territory. The EU and the US, once the architects of stability, faced crises of confidence. Into that void stepped new actors, regional powers, insurgent movements, and rival states eager to reshape the order. China positioned itself as a broker, offering alternatives to Western-led institutions. Other states, sensing the shift, aligned accordingly. The idea of a multipolar world, long discussed in theory, began to take shape in practice. Western dominance, once assumed, no longer looked certain. For ordinary people, the new reality was unsettling. Markets fluctuated wildly, inflation bit deeper, and fears of conflict spread. The sense of security that had defined the post-Cold War era evaporated. Citizens across Europe and America realized that peace had never been permanent, only conditional. The rise of partisans symbolized more than one conflict. It was the embodiment of a world where power no longer flowed neatly through governments and treaties. Shadows had become actors, and unpredictability the new constant. As the dust settled, one haunting question lingered: was peace ever real, or had it always been an illusion sustained by fragile agreements and wishful thinking? For the EU and the US, the disaster under Kiev was not only the biggest of their time, it was the beginning of a world they no longer controlled.